Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our fourth, alas, and final lecture in the series on the Iliad, which has been absolutely great. Um, I love the Iliad, and I'm learning a lot every time I go through it again, and every time I hear Mark speak about these things. It's just been wonderful. I'm sure you're all enjoying it very much as well. Got some great comments, and a few people have sent Mark some questions, and he's had some great answers. It's been great all around. I just want to again thank our donors who make these programs possible, especially the generosity of the literary series In Memory of Amy Quigley. You may remember that the library needs to raise all the funds for programs and materials. Every year we get a grant from the town, but that only funds the operations of the building and the people inside it. But all the programs and e-resources and books and DVDs and everything else, we need to raise money every year for that privately. So thank you to all of our donors. And if you'd like to help us with that or join their ranks, there's a nice big donate button right in the middle of the library's homepage. So thanks again, folks, for that. As usual, use the Q&A button if you want to submit any questions that we'll deal with as many of them as we have time for at the end. And just a quick heads up, we're going to have Mark back in June on 4 consecutive Thursdays, starting on June 3, and he's going to give us a 4-part series on the Victorian novel. And once we have a description in a few days or so, I will send out a heads-up email so that you know what books we'll be talking about. Even before it's ready for you to sign up, at least you can get started reading a couple of the books if you want to try to do that before the program starts. We've got a lot to cover, so now I'm going to turn it right over to Mark. Mark.
Thank you as always, Michael. Thank you everyone for turning out. I will say that continuing in the spirit of Michael's comment, if you've enjoyed the series on ancient Greece, maybe you want to throw a few drachmas the library's way. So as I noted last time, reversal is the dominant theme of the third quarter of the Iliad. Those 6 books last time begin with the Trojans' assault on the city-like defenses of the Greek ships, and they end with the death of Patroclus and the imminent return of Achilles. That is the high point of the Greek standing in the war, and then the reversal. As we would expect, this theme of reversal is extended and enriched in books 19 through 24. When in book 8 earlier, Father Zeus held out his sacred golden scales to weigh 2 fates of death that lays men low, one for the Argives and one for the Trojans. Back then, the scales tip in favor of the Greeks. In book 22, after Achilles chases Hector 3 times around the city of Priam, he repeats this weighing action, and the poet writes, "But once they reached the springs for the 4th time, then Father Zeus held out his sacred golden scales. In them he placed 2 fates of death that lays men low, one for Achilles, one for Hector, breaker of horses. And gripping the beam mid-haft, the father raised it high, and down went Hector's day of doom, dragging him down to the strong house of death, and God Apollo left him." That's book 22, around lines 250, page 548 of the Fagles text. Well, we knew that was coming, that's not the surprise, but note here that here and earlier in book 22, the Prince of Troy is referred to as breaker of horses, rather than with the epithets man-killing Hector or flashing helmet, which is often associated with him throughout the epic. I'll return to this point when I get to the end of my talk. The central subject of Homer's epic, of course, is not really the battle between the Greeks and the Romans. It is rather the wrath of Achilles. And the undoing of that wrath and its extensive implications is more complex than the mere reversal of a balance scale. That is, the death of Hector does not solve the central problem of the poem. Achilles must not only resolve to re-enter the battle and to avenge the death of Patroclus, he must also gain a sense of reverence and empathy, qualities that have been lacking in his character from the earliest lines of the poem. The poem cares about Achilles, and for that matter, everyone, more as a person than as a warrior. When the house of asbestos is described as indestructible, that Greek word aphiton, in the prologue to the section of Book 18, known as the Shield of Achilles, that we talked about last time, that's the last of 5 times that Homer employs that word, indestructible, in the Iliad. So Book 18 is the last time that word shows up. The emphasis on the books that follow, our books tonight, that is the quarter of the poem that we're doing today, falls on destruction and death, degradation and dishonor, as Achilles does not relinquish his wrath, but redirects it. So something that younger readers of the poem, I think, fail to see unless they have an able teacher, and I know many of them do, is that Achilles returning to the battle in his savagery is not a happy solution. It may help the cause of the war, but it doesn't help the status of his, we'll call it soul, for lack of a better word. It's not enough just to be angry in a different way. At the end of Book 19, the newly armored warrior, described as, quote, the fiery runner Achilles, gives out a high stabbing cry. And I'm here quoting from Book 19 around line 500, page 502 of the Fagles text. I know, well, I know, I am destined to die here, far from my dear father, far from mother. But all the same, I will never stop till I drive the Trojans to their bloody fill of war. That's the savagery of Achilles, who actually is the proximate cause of Patroclus's death, which has enraged him, because if Achilles hadn't retired from his responsibilities, Patroclus wouldn't have had to take his place. At the end of Book 20, Achilles is described as inhuman fire and a chaos of fire. Those quotes both come from chapter 20 around line 550. Those are not trivial words to a Greek writer. To be inhuman, to be a chaos, is to be savage, to be feral, to be uncivilized. But these rather abstract metaphors are soon replaced by a graphic image of a blood-soaked, blood-spattered rampager whose quest for glory is covered, quote, in bloody filth. And now I'm quoting from page 519 in Book 20 around lines 560. So the great Achilles rampaged on, his sharp-hoofed stallions trampled shields and corpses. Axle under his chariot splashed with blood, blood on the handrail sweeping round the car, sprays of blood shooting up from the stallion's hoofs, and churning, whirling rims. And the son of Peleus charioteering on to seize his glory, bloody filth splattering both strong arms, Achilles' invincible arms. He is a chaos of death. In Book 21, we're told that like a frenzied god, and insane to hack more flesh, those are both quotes around lines 20 and 35 of Book 21, a frenzied god and insane to hack more flesh. Again, these are not trivial hyperbolic words. They're trying to capture the sense that he is a maniac of revenge, of bloodthirstiness. In that book, he rejects the supplication of Hector's half-brother, Lycaon, in a kind of preview of his own irreverent slaying of Hector in the next book. And the reference in Book 19 that I just cited to the Trojans' bloody fill of war becomes literal in Book 21, when nature itself, in the form of the river god Scamander, is, quote, filled with horror because the river has been, quote, choked with corpses. Those two quotes are from Book 21 around line 250. Still, Achilles, whom the Trojan prince Agenor calls a headlong man and a breakneck man of war, continues to rush to meet his doom with the same recklessness and arrogance he displayed earlier in his argument with Agamemnon. At the risk of repeating myself, but to make sure people get this, the poet does not care that this rage is helping the Greek cause. That's not where Homer's interests lie. He wants to show that something in Achilles is still broken. And so the scene is set for the death of Hector in book 22, where the noble resignation of Hector's fixed resolve, we're told that he stands fast, then he's convinced to run. When he's abandoned by the gods, he accepts his fate. His fixed resolve is sharply contrasted with the irreverence of the taunting Achilles, who says on page 552, "And you, the dogs and birds will maul you, shame your corpse, while Achaeans bury my dear friend in glory." That's book 22, around line 395. As in all ancient Greek works, the defiling of a dead body, even of a stranger, is considered blasphemous. It's one of the worst crimes against humanity and divinity that the Greeks can think of. And that's why the tales where people are not just killed, but cut up, sometimes eaten, where disfiguring is done to bodies, that's an ancient irreverence that this poem taps into. And not only does Achilles continue to taunt Hector after he's killed, dead as he was, says the poet, but the other sons of Achaea, more like a pack of dogs than a group of warriors, are, quote, equally bent on outrage, on shaming noble Hector. That's book 22, line 466. They gloat and stab his body, book 22, 442. That is, they are desecrating the dead man, even though he is dead and no longer an issue. The note provided by Bernard Knox in my Penguin Classic edition, the Fagles translation, is worth repeating here. Quote, "On the conduct of the Achaeans here, an ancient commenter remarked, the emotion of triumph is that of a low mob, and it magnifies the greatness of the dead man." And that note is in the Penguin edition at page 632. So you see another reversal, that as the victory of Achilles in terms of winning the war is rising, so is the status of Hector by virtue of his resignation to his fate, a kind of reverence. And by contrast to the blasphemous Greeks, their butchering of him reflects back on his reverence. On either side of these scenes of death and destruction, Homer presents the pitiable visions of Hector's father's death and of Hector's son's sorrowful legacy. I'm going to read that again, I'm sorry. On either side of these scenes of Hector's death and desecration, Homer presents the pitiable visions of Hector's father's death and of Hector's son's sorrowful legacy, both imaginations by members of Hector's household. The king of Troy's powerful vision of what he himself calls his hideous fate presents a ghastly inversion of what we know to be the master-pet relationship, even in ancient society. Priam imagines this, and this is on page 543. It's book 22, 10 lines from 73 to 83, page 543. This is what Priam imagines when he understands that Hector is now dead. "My sons laid low, my daughters dragged away, and the treasure chambers looted, helpless babies hurled to death, to the earth in the red barbarity of war. My sons' wives hauled off by the Argives' bloody hands. And I last of all, the dogs before my doors will eat me raw. Once some enemy brings me down with his sharp bronze sword, or spits me with a spear, wrenching the life out of my body. Yes, the very dogs I bred in my own halls to share my table guard my gates. Mad, rabid at heart, they'll lap their master's blood and loll before my doors. That's her horrific vision. And I want to pause on that for a moment because what it is it's the failure of civilization. These dogs have had their feral natures domesticated. They're the dogs who have been bred, share his table, guard his gates. Those of you who have pets, they're members of the family. You know that they could be wild animals, but once you domesticate them, they're members of your household. That's why the word exists of domestication. And he recognizes that in the savagery that's befalling his city, his people, his family, the civilization, the domestication of the dogs will be erased and they'll revert to their feral nature. That's his vision of the horror. And on the other side of Hector's death, at the end of book 22, we have the poignant lament of Andromache, who similarly imagines a future, but this time the one that awaits her fatherless son, Astyanax. And this is what I referred to some weeks ago in referencing John F. Kennedy Jr. This is what she imagines. And the boy, only a baby, the son we bore together, you and I so doomed, Hector. What help are you to him now you are dead? What help is he to you? Think, even if he escapes the wrenching horrors of war against the Argives, and he doesn't, we know from other texts, but even if he escapes the wrenching horrors of war against the Argives, pain and labor will plague him all his days to come. Strangers will mark his lands off, stealing his estates. The day that orphans a youngster cuts him off from friends, and he hangs his head low, humiliated in every way. His cheeks stained with tears and pressed by hunger, the boy goes up to his father's old companions, tugging at one man's cloak, another's tunic, and some will pity him true, and one will give him a little cup to drink, enough to wet his lips, not quench his thirst. But then some bully, with both his parents living, beats him from the banquet, fists and abuses flying. You get out, you've got no father feasting with us. And the boy, sobbing, trails home to his widowed mother. Astyanax, she calls out in grief. I mentioned that what's worth the price of admission when you commit to reading this poem carefully are these micro moments that book 22, near the end of this 24 book epic, you have this remarkable evocation of a mother's grief for a son that the Greek audience knows will die, because there are other texts that record that when, or other versions of the story, usually not written, that record that one of the Greeks found Astyanax and threw him from the walls of Troy to avenge the death of Achilles. But here, for the purposes of the humanity, the grieving mother imagines in very concrete detail, tugging at one man's cloak, another's tunic, some will pity him true, and one will give him a little cup to drink, enough to wet his lips, not quench his thirst. That's why I say constantly that this is an anti-war war poem, and it's much more interested in civilization than savagery. And so we see that the death of Hector, the enemy, ravages 3 generations, father, wife, and son. And the emotional responses to his savage slaying usher in the paired funerals for the Greek Patroclus and the Trojan Hector that conclude the epic. Those rites will not only restore a sense of reverence and order to the world of the Iliad, a world that embraces Greeks and Trojans and all humanity equally, they provide the brackets for the extraordinary encounter between supplicating Priam and Achilles, who begins to feel pity in place of rage. Now, I want to say, if you think that I'm making the poem neater, more organized, more symmetrical than it is, I appreciate what might be a compliment, but you're wrong. This is how the poem is constructed. The Greeks will bury their dead and have funeral games, and Achilles will atypically show a kind of generosity in that book. And then there will be this meeting between Priam and Achilles, and then there will be the funeral rites for Hector. Those are the values that the poem most extols. So that meeting between the Greek warrior and the Trojan king, which occurs in book 24, the last book of the epic, results from Zeus's solemn, sound decree. He says on page 591, this is around lines 93 to 95 of book 24, Achilles must receive a ransom from King Priam. Achilles must give Hector's body back. Unusually prosy and terse, unusually involving of Zeus. Zeus has had enough, and he declares no ifs or ands or buts. Priam has to pay up, and Achilles has to give the body back. But notice the construction puts Achilles in the subject of each sentence. Achilles must receive a ransom from King Priam. Achilles must give Hector's body back. If you've been reading along with the series, or if you've read the last book of the Iliad recently enough to have a good experiential memory of it, you know it takes a long time to move from Zeus saying this is what has to happen to it actually happening. Nearly half, that is 460 lines, nearly half of the 943 lines in the Fagles translation of book 24 are devoted to what must occur between Zeus's command and the entrance of Priam to Achilles' lodge. That's the kind of delay, the suspenseful delay of something that every listener of the poem in Homer's day not only knows is going to happen, but is going to resolve the essential conflict of the poem, which is the wrath of Achilles. And the moving and intimate encounter between Priam and Achilles, which occupies fully a quarter of the book, is the encounter. That scene is replete with references to hands and pity, the word hands, the word pity, as the supplicating king and father manages to strike a chord in the heart of Achilles, despite the Greek still battling with his own anger. There are flashes of anger even as Achilles starts to soften, which I think adds credibility to what you might think of as his conversion. Achilles agrees not only to returning Hector's body, but he proactively asks, how much time will you need to do it right? And he agrees to a moratorium from the battle to give the Trojans sufficient time to conduct the funeral rites properly. And what's striking here is that was not part of Zeus's decree. Zeus's decree was limited to giving the body back. If Achilles had a mind to, he could throw it out onto the plain. But instead, he makes sure the father has it, that the body is treated with respect. He goes to the trouble of having Priam sleep so that Agamemnon does not find out what's going on, because he rightly fears that Agamemnon will not agree to this kind of respectful treatment of either Priam or his dead son. And so he shows himself to be a true Greek in this courtesy. In the spirit of balanced opposites that I've cited several times in my lectures, the intimate and moving scene between these two grieving men ends with an image of mutual marveling. We're told that each man marvels at the other. Priam, the son of Dardanus, gazed at Achilles, marveling now at the man's beauty, his magnificent build. Face to face, he seemed a deathless god. That's not the word amphiton. That's not the word that imperishable is not the word that Homer uses. So Priam's looking at the godlike Achilles, and Achilles gazed and marveled at Dardan Priam, beholding his noble looks, listening to his word. So one of them, an example of physical beauty and athletic build, like a god. The other, noble and talented at speaking, the other great virtue that the Greeks extolled, success in battle and success in council. And the words of gazing and marveling repeated, and the word behold all show you that this is a scene of radical importance. If you were doing this as a movie, and it has been done several times as a movie, you would almost want to freeze frame that image as a kind of triptych, as a kind of diptych where the two men are balanced inside the lodge of Achilles. So that scene, balanced opposites, two very different men, their status, their age, their physical being, their talents, but each marveling at the other, a true meeting of the spirits, in addition to the generosity of giving the body back and also agreeing to an 11 or 12-day moratorium, depending on how you read the text. And in a broader view, we can see this encounter between a supplicating king and Achilles in the last book of the Iliad as a powerful complement to Chryses' appeal for the return of his daughter from Agamemnon in the first book of the epic. You'll remember that the Greek king's initial refusal to return the captive daughter, Chryses, to her father, who's a priest, sets the central conflict of the poem into motion, because Agamemnon then takes the captive woman from Achilles and something hits the fan. So in the first book, there's that refusal to return the captive daughter. Now, in the final book, Achilles granting the appeal to return a son resolves that issue, and resolve it does. Indeed, the conflict is so completely resolved that Achilles disappears from the epic. He's not even mentioned by name or pronoun in the last 149 lines of Fagles' translation. This is extraordinary. He vanishes from the poem once Priam decides for safety to take off in the middle of the night. Where does the poem focus instead? It moves to the familial and the domestic, as the grieving women of Troy and of Hector's household are given voice. Both the unnamed wailing women of Troy, a kind of chorus of grieving women, very common in Greek epic and Greek drama, and the named women of his household, Cassandra, his sister, in this order, Andromache, his wife, Hecuba, his mother, and even Helen, who at this point is effectively Hector's sister-in-law. Those four women are giving serial laments over the death of Hector. What is Homer's point? Homer's point is this man-eating, man-killing warrior, this prince of the flashing helmet, is completely enmeshed in social network and fabric, which is what matters most to Homer, what matters most to the Greeks. This poem is being written in the 8th century. Several hundred years later, in the 5th century, in the golden age of Periclean Athens, you will have the height of Greek civilization that the Romans so envied. They tried to do everything like the Greeks, including taking their gods and a lot of their stories. So I'm going to pause here for a moment before I turn to the final episode of the poem to ask, with not quite half an hour left, if there are any questions that Michael wants to feed to me now, because I would like, when I conclude with the end of the poem, to coordinate that with the end of my presentation. I want to give Homer the last word, as it were. So Michael, I didn't say this to you earlier, but I know you are flexible. Do you have any questions that people have submitted yet that you'd like me to address?
There are no questions yet. People might have been thinking to wait to the end. So if you want to just pause for maybe a minute, let's see if anybody punches anything in.
Of course, of course.
Yep.
Michael?
Yes.
So since I had time and I wasn't sure I would, let me give that answer that you suggested I might give if there was time. Is that all right with you?
Absolutely. Sure.
So yesterday, one of the attendees, first name David, I'm not going to try your last name, David. I'm sure you do better than I would. Asked the question about what is the longer story contained in any work. How would they have known, the audience of Homer, the mega story of all these characters, the Odyssey, the Trojan horse, Helen, Troy? Would it have been contained in multiple works or myths or in a single work? And what I wrote back to him was Homer's audience would have known much about various and sometimes conflicting details of the events chronicled in Homer's two epic poems. And they would have picked them up from a centuries old, by Homer's time, tradition of oral poetry. This tradition had many practitioners, minstrels performing for pay or goods, for food or shelter, amateur storytellers, and perhaps other members, older members of a person's own family or social group. Writing in ancient Greece is generally believed to have begun around 700 BC. Recall that Homer lived around 800 to 700 BC, so at the end of Homer's time. But books likely did not appear until the 5th century BC. And even then, the preferred mode of transmission of what we would call literary, if we were writing, or cultural matters would have been oral. Some of those amateur storytellers would be trying to perfect their trade, so they might be hired by a household or might become good enough that people would give them money, like a guitar player on a city street. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates argues that writing destroys memory and weakens the mind. He should see what the internet has done. But that was his worry. His worry was that people would be so reliant on writing that they would lose the value, they would fail to exercise their memory. And I concluded my answer to David with, think of how many Americans in the 19th century would have absorbed details about the Mayflower and the first Thanksgiving, about the witches of Salem, George Washington and the Charity, Paul Revere's Ride, Daniel Boone, David Crockett, and on, without ever needing to open a book. Greeks of Homer's day would have gotten the word from what might be considered the really first social network, oral tradition.
Great. So, Mark, we've got a few questions. Maybe in the interest of the time management, how about if I tell you all of them and then you can kind of decide how you want to deal with it?
As long as there are not too many to read before I answer, sure.
So the first one, so let me just go through them and then we'll see how we can handle them. First one, did you see Priam's journey to Achilles as a kind of catabasis or journey to hell? The second one is, why doesn't Priam ever express any remorse for never asking Paris to return Helen to the Argives? And what is the significance of 3 times, meaning 3 times around Troy? The third one I think is an easy one. What are the names of the women who grieve at the end after the death of Achilles and Hector? And the last one, and then we'll let you, and I can repeat them if you want to be reminded. How do you characterize an epic whose hero is a deeply flawed and broken figure, even though he is considered a great Greek? Is there anything else like it?
Yeah. So let me say, I've already answered multiple times, maybe it hasn't stuck, how I characterize this epic and its various heroes. If someone hasn't remembered or missed those lectures, if they're still available, I'm on record literally as having answered that question. I will say that there is a good sense of seeing Priam's journey as a kind of declension into hell because he has to abase himself. He's a king who's lost his son, One of his sons is dead. The other one is a kind of jerk. And his city, he knows, is going to fall. He's imagined his death. His daughter-in-law has imagined her own son's despair. I knew this would happen. What was the next to last question that was put?
The next to the last was, how do you characterize an epic whose hero is a
No,
deeply...
I'm sorry, I got my number wrong. I answered
that
that
one.
by saying I've answered it.
Why doesn't Priam ever express any remorse for never asking Paris to return Helen to the Argives? And what's the significance of 3 with going around 3 times?
Okay, so the 3 one's easy, but let me say the reason he hasn't expressed remorse is he's a king. He's an old man. He's a king. He's not good at expressing remorse. He's not good at doing what he has to do to apologize or supplicate himself to Achilles, which is why it takes so many lines to get him there. And the significance of 3 in this work and others, and I might have referenced this, is the human body is symmetrical. We mainly come in pairs of things, even down to DNA. And because of that, you have things on one hand and things on the other. And there is no word for a third that. There's this, there's that. There isn't in English or most languages a that. It's this, that, and the other thing. 3s complicate and enrich life. Mama bear, Papa bear, baby bear. The 3 parts of Hegelian synthesis: an idea, its opposition, its synthesis. The world is lousy with 3s even before there was a Trinity in the Roman Catholic Church. It's the way people think about up, down, don't move. And so 3 has had for a very long time a mystical significance in works of literature.
Great.
And I'll revert to my ending. And again, it's not to say that I won't take a question or 2 at the end, but I prefer not to do it with questions that have already been answered in earlier installments. Again, Michael, are the tape lectures still available to people?
Yes, they are. The first 3 are on the YouTube channel of the library, and this one will be on there probably, maybe not as early as tomorrow, but within a few days.
Okay, and I mean this absolutely respectfully. It's much better to get the answer to those questions in the context of my speaking, better than I might remember it now.
Can I just throw in one quick one if it's quick?
Absolutely, I have time. We're doing well for time.
Okay, good. So this one is, someone is asking, given all the many names of the warriors, why does Homer name them all?
Well, you understand that he doesn't name them all.
Yeah.
If you have even a weak imagination of what the plains would look like, he mentions only a few.
Sure.
But the nature of an epic that celebrates valor is you name the guys. There's no servant number 1 or servant number 2 the way there is in Shakespeare. These guys are going to be named. Not only are they going to be named, they're going to be nicknamed, and they're going to be epithets, and they're going to be hailed as the son of their fathers and so on. So that's a big deal. I've mentioned in an earlier lecture how important earthly fame was. You got to have a name. Yeah.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay, let's go.
So I want to conclude in what I think of the way this entire lecture series and the poem has been following a trajectory, which is this intense celebration of the values of civilization. We mentioned more than once in the Odyssey that the wanderings of Odysseus, with all their interesting adventures and monsters and near-death escapes, are not as valuable to Homer as the fact that people give him a bed, that people let him come in and lie down and have food. That is absolutely the glory of the works of Homer. This is not a Schenker read. This is the way the poems work. And I'm reminded that when Erasmus wrote his poem, his work Utopia, which meant nowhere. It's not utopia, which would mean a good place. It's utopia. And believe me, Erasmus knew, not Erasmus, St. Thomas More, I'll back up. When St. Thomas More published his Renaissance work, Utopia with a U, his Latin was good enough to know that the title of that work means nowhere, not best place. And in that essay, little story, a character named Sir Thomas More is visited by a traveler named Raphael Hythloday, who has come from a distant land named Utopia, to talk about how great the society is, how they figured everything out rationally, how everything works fine. It sounds a little bit like the Soviet or communist Chinese state. Number of children, people are tested for their abilities, everything is orderly and reasonable. And as the day wears on, and Raphael wears on himself, the character of St. Thomas More in the book says to him, look, it's getting dark, by which he means, I'm tired of you. Why don't we have some food? I'll be happy to put you up for the night, and we can continue this conversation in the morning. And that's where the book ends. And many people mistake that book, including people who teach it, I'm sorry to say, as an example of utopian, that's how we mean the word now, an ideal society. You need to know very little about Sir Thomas More, St. Thomas More, to know that he did not think that reason was the key to life. What he does in that work, which is not to be missed, although it's often missed, is everything that Raphael Hythloday says in Thomas More's terrific invention is not worth anything alongside the act of charity where a host says to a stranger, look, take a break, have some food, go to bed. The message of utopia is that there is no place that is perfectly reasonable, but acts of charity are always possible. It's a magnificent turnaround. It's a fantastic book that is misunderstood by many people. And so in the same spirit that the secret, the open secret of this war poem is about civilization, we turn to the final note of the poem being struck in the closing description of Hector's burial. This is from page 614, the very end of the poem, so you don't have to worry about lines. The very end of book 24, the end of the poem. Then they collected the white bones of Hector, all his brothers, his friends in arms mourning, and warm tears came streaming down their cheeks. They placed the bones they found in a golden chest, shrouding them round and round in soft purple cloth, purple, the color of majesty. They quickly lowered the chest in a deep hollow grave, and over it piled a cope of huge stones closely set, then hastily heaped a barrow, posted lookouts all around for fear the Achaean combat troops would launch their attack before the time agreed. And once they'd heaped the mound, they turned back home to Troy, and gathering once again, they shared a splendid funeral feast in Hector's honor, held in the house of Priam, king by will of Zeus. And so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. And so we see again that epithet, which only comes into play near the end of the poem, breaker of horses. Notice that the poem does not end with the word Troy or the house of Priam, or even the will of Zeus, who gets the next to last line. It ends with, and so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. And why breaker of horses? Because what the poem values most is what the ancient Greeks most valued: civilization. Civilization is where horses are tamed, that's what's meant by breaking, to make possible things as diverse as agriculture and festival games. That is to actually make something more than war, where a man-killing prince can also be a father and a son, a husband and a brother, where funeral rites, another hallmark of civilization, are given the last word in Homer's great poem of savagery and civilization, where civilization requires domestication. And now we have a little bit of time still, and I'm happy to take additional questions. But that's the message I really wish you would take with you about this remarkable anti-war war poem, which, as in all of the great body of Greek tragedy and epic is an extolling of the fragility of civilization, of civilized people, why so many of the tragedies have berserk people, terrible actions done to people, like the marauding Achilles in these books this evening, because that's the fear that civilization can be destroyed by such people.
Well, Mark, that was fabulous. The connection that you drew to More's Utopia is something that has never occurred to me, but it makes a tremendous amount of sense. I'm going to have to think about that quite a bit more. Probably go back and read More's book again, which I took in a class at Yale 35 or so years ago called The Idea of Utopia, where we read almost all of them. Anyway, the comments are coming are not really questions, just people thanking you for a great program. And one in particular, I want to tell you, who says these lectures are like the hospitality of being offered a meal and a place to sleep for the night. Thank you very much.
Well, what a lovely thing. And let me say before I forget, not that I'm leaving early, but in this season of Passover and Easter, I want to say to all my friends in this webinar room that whether you formally or informally celebrate those rituals of renewal, whether you're happy that spring is here, I don't mean this glibly, whether you're a fan of the fact that the baseball season will start, maybe you're waiting with the rest of us for civilization to come back full swing. It's a tremendous thing to realize how precious and how fragile the things that are the hallmarks of civilization and how easy it is to lose them. I will say relative to the end of Utopia, some of you must know the terrific book by Michael Cunningham called The Hours, which was also made into an impressive movie. And that book imagines three women, a fictional imagination of Virginia Woolf, whose novel Mrs. Dalloway informed The Hours. Virginia Woolf's working title of Mrs. Dalloway was The Hours, in the sense that it's mortality that wears us down. The hours are the enemy. So one character in that book and movie is the historical Virginia Woolf imagined in the novel. Another is a woman named Mrs. Brown, who is unhappy in her marriage, even though she has a lovely little boy. And she takes herself to a motel with an intention that she's spared because she spends her time in the hotel rereading Mrs. Dalloway. That is to say, she has a liaison, not with a man or a woman, she has it with the character of Mrs. Dalloway. And the third character in the novel is a contemporary woman in, I'll think it's maybe 1980s and 90s Greenwich Village, who's named Clarissa, and who is seen by her friends as a modern Mrs. Dalloway. That is, someone who brings people together. And in the course of the novel, and if you've never read it, do, and I will not give any spoilers, but in the course of the novel, there is a scene in which a stranger to the apartment that Clarissa is in comes in, and it's a remarkable revelation of who this character is. She tells a story, and Clarissa's response is, look, it's late, you must be tired, you must be hungry. We had all this food set up for a party that we had to cancel. Why don't you have some things to eat and go to bed, and we'll talk about it in the morning. Michael Cunningham, who is a brilliant writer, has to know that he was invoking Thomas More's, I say Christian only because More was a Christian, but of course there's no brand. A human response to someone in need, even though a stranger, and the response, like in the Odyssey, is take a break, have some food, rest, and then leave. That's exactly how the encounter between Priam and Achilles ends. They have food, sleep here for the night, you can leave in the morning. Remarkable. I recommend it to you. And if you want to see the movie, I recommend reading the novel first. I have nothing against movies and movie adaptations of good books. I watch them all the time, but I would urge you to read the novel, very readable, before you see the movie. The Hours.
Fantastic. Another great allusion and connection. Well, having seen no further questions and only comments being thank you for a wonderful series, let's all go on and enjoy our evenings. And we'll see Mark back here on June 3. Hopefully, most or all of you will be joining us for 4 weeks about the Victorian novel. Like I said, I will send out a heads up email fairly soon describing the program. We don't expect you to read an entire Victorian novel each week for 4 weeks, but with the heads up email from me, you'll find out which 4 Mark will be referring to, and that'll give you a couple of months to read 1 or 2 of them before we get to the program. So once again,
I'm doing 1 novel each of the 4 lectures in chronological order. It will cover male and female writers, and it will cover from the 1840s to the 1890s. So a pretty good survey, 1 novel each lecture. Thank you, Michael.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Mark. Wonderful program. And everybody enjoy your evening, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Stay well.